use the fact that the dollar is everywhere to our advantage. We can put sanctions on pretty much anyone in the world. We can disconnect you from the global financial system and make your life very difficult. This diffusion rule is kind of an extension of that same logic to the world of compute, where we're going to try to use compute as basically a currency that we use to extend American technical standards, extend American power, and essentially create policy for everybody else in the world. So we have a free-for-all at the state level in terms of AI policy. I have a bet with somebody right now. The final number of AI-related bills introduced in state governments in the 2025 legislative session, will it be closer to 750 or closer to 1,000? I'm on the side of 1,000 on that bet.
Hi, welcome. This is the From the New World podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dean Ball, a research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation, and the author of the Hyperdimensional Substack. We discuss export controls, the third world, and its political economy. We discuss the new Biden administration export controls on AI hardware and model weights, what that'll do to the developing world and American allies, the growing patchwork of disparate impact laws, how we might be creeping into authoritarianism, and Beethoven and other great artists as CEOs. If that's interesting to you, you might also be interested in Dean's new podcast with another friend of the show, Tim Lee. That podcast is called AI Summer, and you'll be able to find it in the description or in any podcast. I also recommend, if you enjoy the show, letting a friend know, either in person or online. It's a great way to help the show, and not only are you helping us, but you're helping someone you know find something interesting and informative. Without further ado, here's Dean Ball. 3 days ago, we had new export controls officially drop. What's the deal with those export controls?
Well, it's kind of a continuation of a long story that in some ways started with the Trump administration, but really I think started in October 2022 when the Biden administration set this goal of creating a so-called small yard and high fence with regard to China. The idea was there's a limited number of very, very powerful AI computing hardware and the semiconductor manufacturing equipment that you would need to make your own version of that hardware. And, we're worried about AI being used by adversarial nations, but especially China, for military purposes, cyber offense, things like this. And so we are going to restrict the export of those types of chips to China. That set us down a path that the diffusion rule, which is the rule that came out earlier this week, sort of is the latest iteration of, or sort of the latest step we've taken on that path. The basic way to think about it is that we've gone from a small yard, high fence to the explicit objective of the diffusion rule is the United States government is going to regulate the global diffusion of frontier AI models and frontier AI compute all over the world in every single country.
Yeah, I think it'll be obvious to everyone why I find it particularly worrying once we actually look at the list of countries on this new diffusion rule, on this new rule that limits essentially to a very small number how many GPUs each country can have, as well as limiting model weights as well. And that list includes countries like Portugal, Switzerland, Israel, Poland. Like, these are not our enemies. These are our allies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The important context to understand going into this is this really I think this is a great case study in how policy that starts with what sounds like a relatively small and narrow objective can kind of spiral into something much bigger quite quickly. And usually this takes decades. Something like the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, is like, well, we're going to just have some review for things that could impact the environment. And it turned into this gigantic thing that stops the federal government from doing a huge range of different, important work, including combat wildfires. Like the story of how you got from the modest NEPA, 6-page law to this sort of gargantuan Lovecraftian piece of environmental regulation. That's like a 50-year story. But the story that we've seen with the export controls has taken place really over just a little over 2 years, October 2022 to the present. And what specifically happened is there were these loopholes in the versions of the export controls that we had beforehand. Basically, if you're China, you can't directly buy NVIDIA's top-end AI GPUs, but you can rent data center space in Malaysia or in Indonesia or in Singapore, or you can route GPU orders through Singapore. So you can create an LLC or some sort of other type of corporate shell, and you can acquire high-end GPUs through that shell that's headquartered in a different country that is not export controlled. So the diffusion rule, so what it comes down to is, in order to keep the GPUs out of China, it turns out that we've found ourselves having to regulate the sale of GPUs to every country on Earth. So it does, the diffusion rule divides the world into 3 zones. Tier 1 is like all the countries with really bad birth rates, all the countries with terrible demographics.
Yeah, it looks like so. What with a few exceptions,
Yeah.
what the diffusion rule looks like is that if you've seen the meme of like every global development stat ever, it's like the first world with a few exceptions, the second world or the developing world, and then like a few countries that are really bad plus China.
Yeah, it's green, yellow, red, right? And so it's the United States, Western and Northern Europe, and then Japan, Korea, and Taiwan in tier 1. And basically, if you're tier 1, you can do whatever you want. You can export as many chips as you want. You can buy as many chips as you want. Business proceeds more or less as usual with some caveats. Tier 3 is China and the people that are otherwise our enemies, Afghanistan, Russia. And those countries get nothing, which was also the status quo beforehand. So those countries continue to get nothing. The real changes come for tier 2, and tier 2 is everyone else in the world. It is everybody from Yemen to Israel, as I think Dylan Patel from Semi-Analysis pointed out. So it's people that are very close allies of the United States, and also countries that have in the last month fired munitions at American naval vessels. So that's the range of countries that we're talking about here. It's almost all of Africa, almost all of Latin America, etc. And the tier 2 countries have a variety of different caps that are applied to them. And I can go into all the details on it, but the basic way to think about it is that you'll be able to buy small orders of GPU, the kinds that like a research university might want, a couple hundred of the latest B100 chips from NVIDIA, you'll be able to get without a license. If you want to go above that, you have a country cap of 50,000 H100 equivalents, which you can spend as an individual country between now and the end of 2027. And then in addition to that, companies within a specific country can apply for what's called a validated end user license. So let's say a data center company in Poland, which is a tier 2 country, or in Kenya, another tier 2 country, those companies can apply to the US government for a license. And if they adhere to certain use-based restrictions and certain cybersecurity standards that are quite stringent, in fact, those companies can get up to 320,000 H100 equivalents between now and the end of 2027. Keep in mind that these numbers, you're going to hear, and any DC think tank foreign policy person is going to cite these numbers to you in H100 equivalents, but the H100 is the outgoing version of the chip. Yeah. So it's a little bit inflationary. It's going to sound like a much bigger number than it is, because basically every year, the way to model it is the performance of NVIDIA's chips doubles, and they release new chips every year. So the number goes down by it gets halved every single year. So it's 320,000 H100 equivalents and 160,000 B100 equivalents approximately between now and the end of 2027. But each company in a country can apply for that. And then in addition to that, basically our companies, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, the hyperscalers that are already really leading the AI build out, they can get something called a universal validated end user license, which means that they can deploy, with that license, they can deploy as many chips as they want all over the world, so long as for the American companies, 50% of their total compute capacity has to remain in the United States. 75% of their compute capacity has to remain in the tier 1 countries, and no individual tier 2 country can get any more than 7% of the company's total compute capacity. So I think the basic way to think about this is A, it massively advantages our own companies. So I think it's a protectionist policy because the companies that are going to be best situated to comply with all these various rules, and this is iteration 1, like the cybersecurity rules and the use-based restrictions, this is iteration 1, but there's nothing stopping you from ramping that up over time. Companies best able to comply with them will be the American hyperscalers. So this puts our companies in pole position to lead the build out of AI infrastructure across the world. And it also essentially means that it is unlawful, according to the United States government, to train a frontier model anywhere other than on US soil, just as a practical matter.
Yeah, it really reminisces of the kind of national champion doctrine where we're going to choose Microsoft and OpenAI, or we're going to choose Amazon and Anthropic, or so on and so forth. We're going to choose Google, and they're going to be essentially an arm of US diplomacy, an arm of AI diplomacy around the world. What's really curious, and I do want to steelman this argument for a moment. I think you mentioned it. The idea is that, you had companies renting out compute to China, or, selling GPUs to China, smuggling GPUs to China. There are some documented examples of this. I'm just really confused at how this list was chosen. Like, are there documented examples of Portugal doing this, or Switzerland, or Poland? Is there a reason why, like, some of the countries that we might expect, who we traditionally consider U.S. allies, didn't make the cut?
Well, it definitely says something about the Biden administration's level of trust in all these different countries. And maybe I know that Portugal, for example, has had Belt and Road style infrastructure investments by the Chinese. So there's probably a variety of complexities there. One other thing to remember is that, really, practically speaking, the tier 2 rules, they're like a classification for companies headquartered in those countries. So you have to, as a company that's trying to build out AI infrastructure, you have to get a license for every country that you deploy in. So what that means is, like, if you want to deploy 30,000 H100 equivalents, if you're a Portuguese company and you want to deploy 30,000 H100 equivalents in Portugal, then you have to get a validated end user license from the US government for that. But if that same company wants to deploy 30,000 H100s in Kenya, they have to get another license, another validated end user license for their activities in Kenya. And so I think the idea is, like, how much do we trust the companies and how much control do we want to exercise over the companies that are there? Now, of course, one other practical reality is there are not Portuguese companies that are acquiring 30,000 H100s to do anything.
Fair enough.
So in a weird way, what this diffusion rule does is kind of preserve and lock in the status quo. It's a ton of rules. It's 170 pages of rules. And in a lot of ways, all it does is reinforce the status quo with just a lot more rules and a lot more US government oversight and visibility into sort of what is happening all over the world.
Being in these kinds of niche issue area fights, we end up with allies that are sometimes pretty unusual for, I think, someone of either your or my political persuasion.
Mm-hmm.
But one big criticism of this kind of strategy and of AI restrictions, open source restrictions from the left is exactly this idea that, it's just reinforcing American hegemony. This is what they would use, is that you have the core, which is America and which is all of these ex-colonial powers. And then you have the periphery, which is like the global south. And the global south, they're kind of poor, they're disadvantaged in trade networks, and they're disadvantaged in access to technologies. I'm not entirely sure how much better of an explanation that is compared to the traditional economics explanation that their institutions are just kind of restrictive and they're being held back by their own institutions or lack thereof. But here, I mean, it's just in the rule, right? It literally says tier 2 country right in front of me on this map that Bloomberg has. It's literally a policy of making tier 2 countries. And so, I think that you're absolutely right in the present that Brazil is not competing. Argentina is not competing. Poland, their economy is getting a lot better, but in terms of frontier AI, they're not competing. In some of these examples, Brazil, India, the UAE, that might change if not for this policy. And that might have very real consequences aside from just the intended effects of hurting China or some of these other adversaries. What do you think the long-term effect actually is? Do you think that there's credibility in this global development angle?
Yeah, I do. I think especially if you look at the richer and larger countries that are in the tier two group, and Brazil and India are great examples. I was reading Dylan Patel in Semi Analysis of a 4 point something gigawatt, a 4+ gigawatt data center project that has been proposed. I don't think any shovels are in the ground, but it was proposed in Brazil, and 3 gigawatts of that electricity supply are already available, fully ready to go, basically. We don't have any 3+ gigawatt data centers in the United States. We may by the end of the decade, but that's a big lift. That's a lot of electricity for to add to the American grid. And this certainly you could build a 4 gigawatt data center if you wanted in Brazil now, but you're not going to be able to buy the GPUs to make use of that power now. So it does kind of take that off the board, and it basically, I mean, one way to think about this is it's a regulation on anybody who wants to do large scale computing, frontier AI computing everywhere else in the world, essentially making it impossible or very difficult for them, and giving a leg up to our companies, to American companies below a certain cap, and then like above that cap, it's just straight up impossible. And frontier AI development truly can only happen in the tier one countries, and that's going to predominantly be the United States. So yeah, I mean, I think like it's there's publications like Jacobin, right? You have like your sort of far left people who talk about the American empire, and they talk about how America wields an enormous amount of power throughout the world through things like the financial system, the dollarized financial system, and we use the fact that the dollar is everywhere to our advantage. We can put sanctions on pretty much anyone in the world. We can disconnect you from the global financial system and make your life very difficult. This diffusion rule is kind of an extension of that same logic to the world of compute, where we're going to try to use compute as basically a currency that we or a resource that we use to extend American technical standards, extend American power, and essentially create policy for everybody else in the world. The one thing that's different though is the US dollar, at least, we print the dollars here on American soil. It is crazy to me, frankly, to see the US government exerting this kind of power over a product that by and large is not manufactured in the United States.
Yeah, manufactured in Taiwan.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is that one other way you can read the map, other than advantaging countries that are already developed, is that it's kind of free reign for any country that is already sort of under the American empire. This might be how someone from Jacobin sees it, France, the UK, Germany, and limiting access to anyone who we want to kind of bring further into the American empire,
Mm-hmm.
and bring further into American control.
Yes, I think so. I think that's right. And this doesn't even get into the maybe the most controversial and I think kind of poorly thought through aspect of the whole rule, is that there are also export controls placed on model weights.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
this is not like some of your listeners may be familiar with the Enforce Act, which did not pass but was proposed in the last congressional session. Basically, that would have de facto banned open source models above certain thresholds by prohibiting the export of any model weights. This is actually the opposite. Open source models under this rule, you can export. It's closed model weights that you can't without a license. So you need an export license. Like if you are,
And is this a license for the tier 2 countries or for tier 1 and tier 2?
This is for tier 2. So if you're Microsoft and you want to run, an open AI model, a closed weight open AI model in a tier 2 country, then on a data center that's located in a tier 2 country, then at some point the weights must be transmitted to a computer that is physically in that country, right? And that is considered an export of those weights for the purposes of this law. And yeah, that basically you have to get a license for that. And I think it's in practice, like I said, will in practice be impossible to train these models. And I think in practice, it might be, it's going to be very difficult to even run these models in the most advanced models in tier 2 countries. Now, the one thing is that the threshold for what is an advanced model, it's a very familiar threshold for you and me. It's 10 to the 26th flop, which is the same thing we saw in the Biden executive order. It's the same thing we saw in the California SB 1047 bill, which was a big debate last year. That threshold actually not automatically, but it goes up over time with the compute requirements of the most capable of the largest open source model. So if there's an open source model that gets released that's 10 to the 27 flop, then 10 to the 27 flop in essence becomes the new threshold for triggering the export controls on advanced model weights. So as long as open source continues to advance, the model weights can still move around the world relatively freely, even for closed models. But if open source stops advancing, then we're basically frozen in place where we are right now.
So with the release of models like OpenAI's O1 or O3, there's an open question of like, what does it actually mean for the model weights themselves to be better, right? So you see these systems like O1, and for the reader, of course, I know you know this, but for the listeners, they're capable of scaling based on how much compute you put into them at inference time. So when you're actually asking the model for the answer. And what happens if you have an open source model that's better than kind of O1 mini, which is the small version of this test time compute model that OpenAI has, but is like worse than O1 Pro, right? And I'm assuming that, O1 Pro has the same weights. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't actually know, but it's theoretically possible that such a model exists that, is worse than an open source model with the same weights, is worse than an open source model at some amount of compute, and better than an open source model at some higher amount of compute. How does the rule apply to those?
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting because so what you're talking about is the inference based scaling paradigm. So
Yeah.
you might run O1 for 5 minutes, you might run it for an hour. As these models get more powerful, you might spend $1 million to run it for 6 hours, right? Like in theory, that's
Yeah. This is a really fun interjection, but do you remember like the Arc AGI solve?
Yes.
So there was a new O3 model from OpenAI, and there was this bounty for Arc AGI, which is this kind of puzzle challenge for AI models. You can actually do it yourself. It's actually kind of pretty easy for humans.
Kind of like an IQ test, like a shape rotation type of IQ test.
Yeah, they're rotating the shapes.
Yeah.
And it was very funny because OpenAI ended up claiming this bounty. I don't know if they actually collected the money or not, but they passed the threshold. And the thing is, they spent, I think, double the bounty prize in compute. Yeah. So they spent so long running the model that they spent more money than they would have gained from claiming the prize. So this is already the degree to which people are kind of varying the performance of their AI by spending more and more time just running it.
Yeah, and I think, you do on really hard problems, on problems that are really hard for language models, let me amend that, you get reliable performance increases oftentimes with scaling this. So interestingly, though, NVIDIA's top-end inference specific chip, which is the H20 and the B20, as opposed to the H100 and the B100, the sort of less performant chip for training purposes, but really, really good for inference, those are actually not export controlled. So in theory, China or anyone else in the world can buy fleets of those chips and run, at least as of right now. There are more export controls coming out this week, possibly even today. So that could change in real time. But as of the day that the diffusion rule came out, The H-20 was not export controlled. So Chinese can buy fleets of those things and they can run reasoning models. A Chinese AGI lab called DeepSeek has a version of O1 that they call R1. And they could run that model for as long as they wanted, doing whatever they wanted. There's no export controls on that at all. So it is interesting that, even though these rules, I mean, the Biden administration has thrown hundreds of pages of new rules once a year at at the export control problem. And even with that, and all the minds, the think tanks, all the technocrats who are working on this, they're still kind of behind sort of where the industry is going.
Yeah. You mentioned that this policy really advantages U.S. companies, the companies that want to deploy 50% of their compute in the U.S. and then, 7% of their compute in all of these countries. They only have to apply once.
Yeah.
I think it's always important in these situations to consider the political economy and kind of who was in the room when it happened, What's the interest around setting these compute rules in this way?
So I think, to a first approximation, one good way to understand the whole weird tier 2 system and everything about it, it was quite influenced by the Gulf states, the Persian Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, etc. Very, very wealthy petrostates that are trying to diversify their economies beyond oil extraction. And those companies, those countries and companies within them, they have hundreds of billions of dollars, $1 trillion sovereign wealth funds. And so they've been saying since ChatGPT, there's been a strong interest. The UAE said, we're going to build super intelligence in the desert. We want to string together 2 million H100s with all of our, we have all this, hydrocarbon based energy. They're kingdoms. So the substantial power of the state, they don't have to deal with NEPA in the UAE. And they were talking about doing that. And the US got very nervous about this. And so a lot of the things you see about, 7%, only 7% of compute in a tier 2 country can be deployed. A lot of that comes out of sort of negotiations with the UAE and wanting to be sure that, we don't want to lose them as friends. We don't want them turning to China. We still want to be able to provide them with more compute than the Chinese can, but we want them to not spend their $1 trillion on bigger compute clusters than we have. And to the extent that they build gigantic compute clusters, we'd really like it. In an ideal world, I think we'd want American companies to build those clusters and run them. And in a slightly less ideal world from the perspective of our government, I think we want the companies that do build them to at least conform to American standards for security and use and things like that. So that's like a big part of what motivated this whole thing, is really like what goes down in the Persian Gulf in the next few years.
Yeah, I think there's a long and rich tradition of Middle Eastern either wealth funds or managers making the pilgrimage to the US and investing in American Silicon Valley tech companies. You had Masayoshi-san, who's from, Japan, but is the person who manages one of the major Saudi funds, talking about striking a deal for $1 trillion with Sam Altman. And I think you're right. We'd like less of the building out of domestic capabilities in Saudi or in the UAE, and we want more of the money going to American companies. And, I think many of those American companies are doing great things, but we also should be transparent. That's what's going on here.
Yeah. And I think to a certain extent, it's just like the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is the part of the Department of Commerce that is principally tasked with enforcing kind of all this. There are only so many government agencies are hard to be friends with. And there's only so many sort of reliable, trusted counterparties a government agency can have. And so it makes it much easier. If there's 500 data center US infrastructure, AI infrastructure providers trying to build all over the world, 500 is a lot of friends to have, and it's a lot of people to sort of keep tabs on, and can we really trust them, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, I think the people at the Department of Commerce, I mean, this is how regulatory capture happens. A lot of people think of regulatory capture as like some sort of like a statutory phenomenon, like the kind of thing that gets encoded in law and that's how it happens, but like not really. I think regulatory capture is a sociological phenomenon. It's like the people who are approving these applications at the Bureau of Industry and Security, if they see Microsoft on the application, if they see Google, if they see Amazon, they're just going to feel more comfy with that. They're going to feel better about that because they know who they are and it's reliable, and they're probably not going to lose their job if they check the yes box on a Microsoft application. Whereas if it's some random company that was started 6 months ago that maybe has a lot of venture capital funding, maybe has the money to actually do this, but maybe the government doesn't know as well, it's a little bit harder for them. It's like a little bit more of a risk. I think that there's no way that the large American hyperscalers were not intimately involved in the crafting of this rule.
Yeah, that would be something that would be very interesting for certain people to leak. There's no video on this podcast, but I'm staring into the camera. Yeah. Hypothetically, if it were hypothetically true and someone were hypothetically to leak it, it would be very interesting. Yeah, and I am sympathetic to the plight of many specific countries, maybe less so the Gulf monarchies, which are already pretty rich, but Nigeria, Kenya, you already mentioned. I know our mutual friend Tyler Cowen. He's said publicly many times that some of the places where AI can have the biggest impact in kind of developing institutions and developing kind of commerce rules and kind of managerial rules is the developing world, where they don't have where it's not even like they're replacing some human version of it. They just don't have it. And they just need that kind of fabric there. I am sympathetic to that, but at the end of the day, the cutting edge AI is not necessarily going to be developed there, not necessarily going to be trained there. Maybe the weights, maybe that's a bigger problem for them. But with AI, there's always been the question of how long is it until foreign policy becomes domestic policy? Do you think that there's a chance that the US government tries to adopt similar rules for domestic companies?
That's a great question, and there are some there's some ways in which I think that the diffusion rule, if it stands in the Trump administration, might actually be a backdoor already to domestic policymaking. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. The American hyperscalers, and there could be some others, the sort of like CoreWeave, the Neo clouds as they're called. Basically, these are data center builders, infrastructure as a service providers who are not nearly as big as Amazon or Microsoft or Google, but they're also dedicated specifically to AI infrastructure. And NVIDIA is a big fan of them. NVIDIA definitely wants there to be like a lot of people bidding for their chips. So NVIDIA gives allocations to a lot of these companies to kind of like try to keep them competitive. So it's,
based Neo Brandeisian NVIDIA.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think if you're any of these companies and you want to apply for the universal validated end user status, you do have to conform with cybersecurity restrictions and rules that are based on a combination of NIST standards and also the federal government's basically their standards for sort of interacting with them, which is called FedRAMP High.
Wait, is this API as in, like the same APIs in software, application programming interface?
Yes.
Okay, so it's the same thing. Okay.
Yeah,
good to know.
Exactly. So this is right. So this is, FedRAMP High is like the standard that the federal government has for contractors of the federal government that want to do business with them and sort of like interact with non-classified federal data. So that is the standard that you have to conform to for AI infrastructure that you build in tier 2 countries. And I think
and is that at a firm-wide level? So like, let's say, Microsoft is deploying a model in like Africa, right? In Kenya, let's say, in one of the tier 2 countries.
Mm-hmm.
do they have to conform to those regulations just for the model version that's in Kenya, or does it have to be across all of their models?
It would be based on the compute, the hardware, basically. It would be a combination of the hardware and the model weights. So yeah, basically anywhere in tier 2 for sure, where they're deploying either advanced AI compute or advanced model weights or both, they have to conform to these standards. And I think also for tier 1 countries that are not the United States, don't quote me on that. That might not be true, but I think it's also true that they have to conform to these standards for tier 1 countries that are not the United States. And I think like what that kind of means in practice is that I kind of suspect that these cybersecurity standards and also, you know, there's no law from God that says that this has to remain restricted to cybersecurity. It can be about a lot of different things. I think the standards that the data centers have to, that the data center providers have to adhere to can grow, and there already are use-based restrictions on the tier 2 end. Like they have to surveil their customers, right? Like that's what it comes down to. In tier 2 countries, like a data center provider they have to know what their customers are doing, because they have to prevent them from training frontier models. They have to prevent them from doing certain kinds of prohibited use cases, et cetera, et cetera. That can easily expand over time. And I think that it could become de facto domestic policy, because the American hyperscalers are going to have to conform to these rules pretty much everywhere in the world where they do infrastructure build out. The vast majority of their infrastructure build out will take place in the United States, regardless of this rule, most likely. But I think that over time, the rules really could become de facto domestic policy. So we're now in a situation where the export controls, again, which started with small yard, high fence, we're now in a world where they are so broad that we're actually regulating companies, like the business practices of American companies in America. We're setting domestic policy through export controls. That's how broad this has gotten. It's just 2.5 years. I think it is a fascinating political economy story. I think it's just so like it's amazing in the kind of like almost cellular automata like way in which like we've gone from, we want to keep GPU. It's the meme with the small domino and then the big domino at the end.
Well, I think there's an obvious explanation for this.
Sure.
Which is that there is a huge gulf in terms of AI policy between Democrats in Congress and the Biden administration.
Yes.
And this is public. There have, at this point, been statements from Pelosi, from Schumer, official documents from Schumer. Their strategy is just not the same. And I think there's a very simple reason for why we're doing domestic policy via foreign policy, is that you do foreign policy via the executive branch and you do domestic policy via Congress. And Congress just isn't having it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and just consider how incredible it is. We are ostensibly a democratic republic that is founded on the rule of law. And I'm saying this like regardless of what you think about the diffusion rule and whether or not you think it's good or bad, whatever else. Like I see arguments on both sides for this thing, and I think it's a very thorny and complicated issue. Regardless of your substantive opinions, I think there's a certain appreciation, like you just want to like hang this thing on a wall and look at it and admire it aesthetically, that like this global rule for the rollout of a general purpose macro invention across the world is being regulated by one specific department of the federal government, and like no one in Congress ever voted on this. Like this was never approved. And it's just power that was latent in the statute. It's just kind of an amazing moment to reflect on just how broad the authority of the executive branch has become.
Yes, and it's really fascinating from kind of politics angle, because J.D. Vance, the incoming vice president, was criticized for often citing certain post-liberal philosophers like Curtis Yarvin or Patrick Deneen.
Mm-hmm.
And their whole idea was that actually the presidents should seize unilateral power. The executive branch should be able to make all of policy, and there should be much less, essentially, congressional approval for things. Well, it's very interesting because that is the current Biden administration on AI, actually existing post-liberalism.
It's very funny how you have this pattern in American presidential history where, like, just during my sort of paying attention to politics, that period of my life, the the George W. Bush administration from 2000 to 2008, and there were various extensions of federal power that he used, especially post 9/11, things that a lot of people had problems with. And there were these sort of things that were perceived as power grabs, but in retrospect, they were narrow when you consider the ways in which the Obama administration sort of took those narrow power grabs and horizontally expanded them to cover a much wider variety of things. And there's a similar kind of structurally similar phenomenon with the Trump administration, where the Trump administration, people will always remind you, especially if they're supportive of the Biden administration, they will always remind you that the export control stuff with against Chinese high technology started with the Trump administration, because the Trump administration targeted Huawei and ZTE to basically try to kneecap these companies that were competing in a variety of different areas with Western firms, and it worked. Huawei, they're coming back now, but they were taken off the board as a competitor to Apple, even in China domestically, because of this, because of the export controls that the Trump administration used. But the Trump administration was targeting one specific firm or a few specific firms. And then of course, what you see is this horizontal expansion, where first it's going to be, we're going to target the entire country of China. And then actually, to target the entire country of China, we in fact have to regulate things for the entire world. And I'm confident that if we ever settle other bodies, planetary bodies in our solar system, the export controls will apply to those other planetary bodies, right? It's just, it is a never ending.
Sorry, Elon. No GPUs on the moon.
Yeah, exactly.
No GPUs on Mars.
Exactly.
We're not shipping the hundreds to Mars.
Right.
Yeah, but this is very serious. This idea that you'll end up inputting policy on Americans selling to Americans via these measures that are overtly meant for restricting Americans from selling to Portuguese people who are then renting it out to China. Yeah, you really have to question whether the trade-offs are worth it when you get to that many levels of essentially distance.
Yeah, I mean, but to present the other side of the case, though, and why I'm of two minds, and I think it's a very complicated issue. I always I haven't written. I have a I will write about this rule, but I haven't written that much about the export controls. And part of the reason I haven't is that I feel as though my opinions about the export controls will not make anybody happy. Because I will say things that will make proponents of the export controls very happy, and I will also say things that will make the fiercest opponents very happy. I think I will satisfy both the Rand Corporation and Nvidia in my thinking about this issue. But it's very hard for me to imagine a world in which we are really doing unrestricted sales of GPUs to China, and Sam Altman can go on stage at an event and he can say credibly, we would have bigger models, or we would be offering our models for less money, but we can't, because 40% of Nvidia's supply is going to China. It seems politically something we just couldn't realistically tolerate. And at the same time, though, I look at history and I look at moments where very powerful countries have tried to do similar things, and very frequently these types of export control regimes have hurt the industries that the companies were seeking to protect. And so I would be entirely unsurprised if what we're doing here is setting the American semiconductor manufacturing industry, companies like Nvidia and AMD, up for long-term, sort of short-term success and long-term failure, because you're not going to keep the Chinese from developing technology like this forever. Maybe you'll keep them. 10 years would be a really long time. And maybe we'll do that. I know very credible people who think 10 years is actually conservative, but it's we might well be setting ourselves up for long-term failure. And the crazy thing about it is that we kind of might not have a choice. It's a weird structural complexity there.
Yeah, no, and all of this is warped by, perceptions of whether it'll be kind of short-term race versus a long-term race,
Yeah.
right? People who have really, really extreme forecasts of how important AI will be and how quickly, AI that is kind of revolutionary, that will essentially act as, a finish line. If those people think that there's a finish line in 5 years, then, who cares what happens in 10 years? We're getting to the finish line first. And that's the real doctrine that I've been told by, by both people and you can read the papers from these think tanks that's public, and also by, people who would matter in private as well. Yeah, I don't know. I might cut that out. But I interviewed Jeff Ding on this podcast, who has a much longer term economic model. And I think many people, even ones who are more optimistic on the potential for AI, like Tyler Cowen, many economists have a much longer term model of the returns to AI.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if the kind of mainstream economics profession is right, or even, the mainstream, Wall Street is kind of optimistic about AI companies, venture is optimistic about AI companies, but I think they're still relatively, diversified compared to the kind of, compared to what you would assume if they agreed with the kind of short-term finish line position. If we just trust the mainstream, then what these kind of, finish line ideologies or finish line philosophies or finish line policies might be doing is, as you say, setting us up for failure.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I will recommend to any listeners that have not heard your podcast with Jeff Ding to listen to it, because Jeff is great and I learned new things from that podcast. And yeah, I wonder what Jeff would think about the fact that this rule is called the diffusion rule, since Jeff is a scholar of technology diffusion. And
diffusion rule, more like anti-diffusion rule.
Yeah, well, because I mean, like one of the points that Jeff makes that I think is so undervalued by policymakers is not only is it that diffusion is important. I think that's that's seeping through at the elite level in DC. Everyone's like, diffusion matters, and like that's like in large part that is due to Jeff's intellectual entrepreneurship, but also the part of the lesson that I feel has not seeped in is that he will say that diffusion is, especially of a general purpose technology, is best facilitated through a decentralized process, an experimental and decentralized process where, like, almost fractal, like within a team, individual people, within a firm, individual teams, within a country, individual companies, like it's you want it to be kind of decentralized, all the way down to allow for lots of different experimentation. And I would say that a rule that micromanages the actual enabling hardware, like, probably isn't that. And who knows? I mean, it is so hard to model the various ways in which this rule will create loopholes that we can't predict, that will create unintended consequences that we can't predict, and that will kind of, like, you know sort of bias the distribution of possible outcomes here in particular ways that, like, maybe are favorable to us and maybe not, like, hard to know. But certainly we're putting our thumb on the scale in a really big way. So yeah, it, it it's a little bit like, again, I understand why the Biden administration is doing it, but you are also correct that the Biden administration was forward looking in, well, you could call, I mean, either they're like hugely wrong or they're forward looking, where, like, I think they got the AGI bug, artificial general intelligence bug, like, before ChatGPT came out. It was like October 2022 that they decide, maybe they had a hint about it, but I don't think so, because OpenAI didn't seem to know it was going to be a big deal. Like, they seemed to get serious about denying China advanced AI compute right at around that time. And these controls, I think, really only make sense if we are in a world where transformative AI is a short-term reality, like something that's going to happen in the next 5 or 6 years. and also that really like that AI is indeed transformative. So it could well be that we're on the verge of making, systems like 3 generations from '03, '06. Like maybe that system really will be better at coding and math than anybody in the world. I'm prepared to believe that, and that could happen in the next 2 years. And maybe it really will be like super smart. That's going to be extremely useful, but like maybe not as useful as people think. Like, or maybe I would say harder, like more counterintuitive and non-trivial to make productive use of for a business in the economy than you would think. It might not just be like out of the box magic productivity gains. I bet you it won't. I bet you it will be non-trivial. And so again, there's so many ways in which all the different regulations that we're looking at, both domestically and in the foreign policy, are like making that discovery process of what is this technology actually for, I think, harder.
Yeah. And I think really once you start adding nuance to it, Jeff's model makes more and more sense because he's essentially saying there are 2 steps to forming a technological advantage. There's coming up with the technology, and I think everyone agrees on that. Everyone agrees that, it's important to come up with the technology. But the second step, which is very underrated by some, is actually figuring out how to use it. And Jeff argues, historically, with these general purpose technologies, which is conveniently also spells out GPT, is the historical pattern is that it takes a lot of diffusion, a lot of understanding how to apply that technology in your everyday life, in your firms, in your products, all sorts of wild new applications. Remember that many people, there's not that much of a difference between, GPT-3 as it was available in OpenAI Playground, which was essentially this kind of, very rudimentary experimental interface before ChatGPT, and ChatGPT. It was almost the same model. And what really made the difference, what made like something that only like academics and engineers cared about to something that was a global product was the interface. And that's just one kind of microcosm of diffusion, of getting things right, of getting the small features right. And that just doesn't happen if you don't have experimentation, if you don't have, local knowledge, as the economists say. And if we're, locking the kind of developing world out of that, then it just means they won't have the local knowledge to apply it, at least not with kind of locally run models.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really hard. Certainly they can do fine tunes and they can do all this kind of stuff, but I think it will be somewhat harder and it will feel like a little bit more of an imposition from the top down. And, I think there's like, I am very bullish on AI as a kind of governance technology or a public service delivery technology. What I mean by that is if you kind of just like look at the different categories of things that governments do that we think are pro. So, I mean, there's a lot of things governments do that I think like I personally don't think they should be doing, but there's also a lot of things that are like pro-social and good, like education, right, or whatever.
Yeah, we need the roads.
Yeah,
we need the roads. We need the social services.
Yeah,
and to do those social services,
right. And like, there's just so many different ways in which it feels as though AI and also a number of other sort of modern technologies can like really enhance, and in some ways even like perhaps just straight up replace those services. I mean, like if I were a public policy maker in Kenya or in uh Bolivia, I think like my aspiration would be to have a better school system that's dramatically cheaper within like 10 years that's enabled by AI. Like I think Kenya could have a better school system than Baltimore. That also costs like 1/20th the per pupil amount within like I think that's really possible with AI because the thing is that there's so many entrenched interests around like the public school system in any American city, but I'm just picking on Baltimore for no reason other than that it has a famously very bad school system.
Yeah. Do you live around those parts?
I live here, which also has in DC, which also has a very bad school system.
That as
So,
well.
uh,
Yep. So we can pick on ourselves for a bit.
yeah, like the teachers unions and just this whole administrative apparatus that you'd have to kind of like fight and claw back, and you're just going to be making incremental reforms year after year. I mean, I've been involved in education reform stuff for a big chunk of my career, so I've seen all that stuff happen. I've seen that play out in practice. Whereas like there's much more open field in a developing country, doesn't have all those special interests built up, might not even really have a public education system in quite the same way that we think about that here. And like there's just such a great opportunity for AI enabled education. And I want America, I think it would be a great thing for American soft power if American AI systems provided that governance technology, right? Like that, like public service delivery to developing countries and developed countries and our own pupils all over the world. I think that would be huge. And so I do see the geopolitical aims here, and I think that there's a decent chance that it's very smart. But the thing about that is that it does depend on the American industry to execute. That will be hindered by lots of domestic regulations. And so I'm worried about that. I'm worried about the combination of foreign policy and export control rules that make it so like America's in pole position to really lead here, and then that we kind of fall on our face, that we kind of
just don't.
because we overregulate.
Yeah, you mentioned the social services. You mentioned how the government uses AI, and I'm sure many private firms will use AI to essentially mediate between human and institution. Now, that's something that's under a lot of scrutiny recently, especially at the state level. What's happening at the state level?
So we have a free-for-all at the state level in terms of AI policy. I have a bet with somebody right now as to whether or not we're betting on will the final number of AI related bills introduced in state governments in the 2025 legislative session, will it be closer to 750 or closer to 1,000? I'm on the side of 1,000 on that bet, and I feel pretty good about the odds. But even 750 is a lot. And it's a huge variety of different things, just like last year we had about 650 700 something like that state bills. Vast majority of those bills are pretty anodyne deepfake bills, kind of just like creating a crime to distribute a deepfake of someone that's malicious, right? Okay, a big chunk of them are, we're creating a committee in the state government to study the impact of AI on X, right? That's like a huge amount of it. Another big chunk will be like basically non-starters, just for various reasons. And then there's going to be a handful of substantive regulatory bills. Last year, there were really two or three substantive of the 750, there were like two or three that actually mattered, two of which became law, one of which was vetoed. And the one that was vetoed was SB 1047, which was like the major sort of focused on the catastrophic risk. And from Scott Wiener, we talked a lot about that bill.
Yes, you can check out our previous episode for a long, hours of this. Yes.
Yes. But then you have this bill that came out of Colorado that snuck up on a lot of people, including me, called SB 205 in Colorado. This is a consumer protection bill for AI. And it comes out of a multi-state policymaker working group convened by an organization called the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a nonprofit that does, as it sounds, sort of started out doing like privacy law and has expanded into AI. And really like what their framework, which was first passed in Colorado last year, has now been replicated in 8 other states. It's going to be considered in at least 8 other state legislatures. I bet you it'll be more than that. States like to copy each other, and I think if we see this framework pass in more than 2 or 3 states in the next a couple of months, it will become, I think there's a very high chance that it just becomes the national standard for how AI is regulated. So what does this bill do? Well, first of all, it's nothing like SB 1047. SB 1047 was about harms to society of greater than $500 million. We're talking about like the bio weapon development and cyber risk and making a nuclear bomb and all this with AI and all this kind of stuff that a lot of people dismissed as like science fiction. These bills have nothing to do with that. These bills are focused on the concept of algorithmic discrimination. Basically, the idea that in high risk settings, companies that are using AI and developers of AI systems, and in a lot of cases, also the cloud computing providers, for reasons that kind of escape my understanding, all have to take steps to ensure that AI systems of all kinds, everything from like the smallest statistical models that are technically called machine learning, all the way up to the sort of your sort of OpenAI O3 level models, they all have to take reasonable care to avoid algorithmic discrimination, and they have to do a bunch of preemptive compliance paperwork for anything, again, that's considered high risk, which is defined as anything that could basically defined as anything that could materially affect a consumer's access to things like education, employment, insurance, healthcare, government services, legal services, wide variety of other things, but kind of like of that flavor.
Okay, so this isn't like military stuff. When I think of high risk, I think we're making AI weapons, we're making bioweapons.
Yeah.
This is not that.
There are very few situations with these bills where life or death is on the line.
Yeah, and these are things like, as you said, legal services, health, education. It's basically a grab bag of like, regulated industries.
Highly regulated industries. That's right. That's right. And like, so the thing that is complicated is like it's any and there's some ambiguity about this, but I think the ambiguity is instructive. Like the way it works is you can speak in general terms about these bills. They do actually all differ a little bit, but like in general terms, the way these laws all work is the idea of a consequential decision. A consequential decision is anything that could, if the AI system was a substantial factor in making a consequential decision, and the consequential decision is in turn anything that could affect a consumer's access to or terms and condition of the underlying service. So the thing about that is that doesn't necessarily mean the final decision, right? Like it would be one thing if you passed a law that said, we're going to make you do a lot of compliance and due diligence if you want to use ChatGPT to literally hire people. Like you're just going to collect resumes and you're going to give them all to ChatGPT and you're going to say, which one should I hire? And you're just going to go with whatever ChatGPT says. If you're going to do that, like maybe, we want you to like take some steps there.
I will do that for Alliance for the Future. Fucking sue me.
Yeah, like if you want to have a law like that, reasonable people can certainly debate. But like the thing about the way these laws are written is it's anything that could affect access to or terms and conditions of. So just like as an example,
so it's much broader than that.
If I'm trying to hire someone and I want to promote the job listing on social media, well, I'm using an algorithm there, and the way that the bills find a social media algorithm, certainly would count for most of these bills. There's an autonomous algorithm out there that is determining who sees my job listing and who doesn't. So I think there's a world in which I, as the employer or prospective employer, have to write an algorithmic impact assessment about that. There is a world in which if I use ChatGPT to write the job description, that would require an algorithmic impact assessment. There's a world in which, let's say I get 100 resumes and I use ChatGPT to filter and I say, please show me people with relevant experience. That might require an algorithmic impact assessment because these are substantial factors in making a decision that could affect access to or terms of the underlying employment opportunity. I don't think that that's necessarily the intention of a lot of the people. It's not what a lot of the legislators who are writing these bills think that they are doing, but writing bills is hard. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the legislators just don't quite understand, they don't understand the implications here. But I certainly think that the laws could be interpreted in this way.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because, we think of AI now as ChatGPT. The way these laws are written, would they apply to like the LinkedIn algorithm?
Yes.
And like, to be clear, like to my knowledge, the LinkedIn algorithm is not using any kind of language model. Before all of this, before ChatGPT was even out, LinkedIn used a recommendation algorithm. It used kind of statistical prediction in order to say, okay, you're looking for these types of roles. Here are people with resumes similar to those types of roles. And the way AI is defined in some of these laws, I'm going to pull up the exact description in a moment, is not just regulating stuff like ChatGPT. It could regulate essentially large fractions of the internet. Artificial intelligence system. Any machine-based system that, for any explicit or implicit objective, infers from the inputs the system receives how to generate outputs, including content, decisions, predictions, or recommendations that can influence physical or virtual environments.
Yes. Modern software, really, is one way to think of it. There's always like the maximalist interpretation of a law, and that rarely is what actually gets done in practice. But the maximalist reading is like linear regressions count, right?
Yes, we had a very old policy paper called AI as a statistical process that makes exactly this point. It's actually quite difficult to draw the line, like legally, to draw the line between ChatGPT, between that and, self-driving, between self-driving and, a chess engine, something like Deep Blue or like Stockfish, to, a social media algorithm, a recommendation algorithm, to, the thing that your shipping company makes to predict how many people are going to order a laptop on any given day. All of those things use similar statistical precursors. And the way that a lot of these laws are defined, by accident or on purpose, essentially regulate large parts of the entire internet. It is really worrying because many people envision, the future of applying for a job is that you have an AI model that takes in your resume, that takes in your personal information, that applies automatically to all of these venues. And all of these venues then sort through based on the information that those AIs provide with their own AIs. Right? What's the practical barrier that it puts on companies who are trying to use these processes?
Yeah. So, first of all, I think you're totally right that there are so many ways in which, in the long term, you can imagine AI like really profoundly transforming the way that we do a wide variety of different things, like job discovery, like dating, right? Like finding a mate, right? All these things. I've heard some really fanciful but fun ideas for how Tinder could work in an era with powerful LLMs. So I think in some ways, one way to like think about these laws is that they kind of freeze the present day. Our present day assumptions about what AI is and about how things should work are kind of frozen into place by these laws, and actually not that different from the diffusion rule in the sense that, like, let's freeze the status quo into place. If you've hated the last 10 years and you've thought they've been really contentious and full of a lot of stupid crap, well, guess what? We're going to lock it into place forever through statute. That's what it feels like is going on here. But on a practical basis, I think there's like a few different ways that it could play out, right? One version is that this becomes a very pro forma exercise that you don't even really think about. Like, I know I was at the Seattle airport a couple of weeks ago, and Washington State has passed some, I don't know, some kind of privacy or algorithmic law that makes you have to go through some sort of disclosure about you're using an algorithm that's recording blah, 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 blah. And I was going up to the Clear terminal, which is the thing you can use to skip the line at it's airport security. And, it's using biometrics that like scans your iris. And I had to like click through something that was like Washington State notice. And I was like, yeah, okay, this is like a state law. And like, maybe it'll be like that, right? Like maybe it'll just be like some quick click, something you quick click through really fast. Maybe it'll be somehow like embedded into the end user license agreement of the language models. But I think what's also quite possible is that the way it works instead is that it really is something that firms who are trying to adopt AI need to do on a per use case basis. So they have to create a risk management plan, which applies to the business practices of the firm overall. They do that once. And then an algorithmic impact assessment, basically for every high risk use case that they identify in their business. That creates a couple of downstream consequences. One, I think, would be that adoption decisions about AI would have to be centralized at the firm management level. Like you would have to, because you, as like the CEO of a company with 1,000 employees or 2,000 employees or something, like you couldn't risk that an employee. What if an employee who was a hiring manager used ChatGPT to hire someone? Like you can't risk that because that would be a high risk use case that would be regulated. And so I think you would have to really centralize and probably surveil employee use of AI. And I think also a centralized process is very likely to be more brittle, slower, less creative, like any committee based process. And very much like when you talk about the sort of Jeff Ding diffusion idea, the decentralized experimentation is not impossible to do, but for anything that might be considered high risk, it's very difficult to do. And a lot of stuff is considered high risk as a practical matter. Another implication that I think is probably true regardless of how it specifically plays out, there are a few categories of American law that there's like a quantum mechanical aspect to some parts of American law where like you're sort of in a superposition of violating and not violating them all the time. And I think that these kinds of consumer protection laws get used by state attorneys general all the time to just sort of get money to basically shake down companies. State AGs file lawsuits based on civil rights and consumer protection constantly. They're very, very broad laws for the same reason that the Federal Trade Commission at the federal level has an extremely broad mandate because, it can police unfair and deceptive trade practices. That's a lot of different stuff. Very subjective. And I think, what it could very well turn into these laws is kind of like a sword of Damocles where maybe nothing happens for the first year, but every firm in the economy and all the AI developers have this looming threat over them that causes them to take certain kinds of actions, certain kinds of compliance actions. Probably also, like, one thing that would be predictable is that language models like ChatGPT or Claude would kind of have to become much more HR like in their tone.
Even more? How do we make Claude even more of an HR goon?
I think the Anthropic will have to innovate in that regard, but this will be the kind of innovation that the law incentivizes.
Yeah, and of
Because
course the tiger lying in wait is Gemini.
right.
Yeah.
Like it's the Gemini thing. Like the Gemini thing that we saw, which is like, the system that produced all these ridiculous images of like, African American founding fathers and stuff like that because of a kind of like internal at Google like sort of woke requirement. I think you would see stuff like that again. And I think it's actually completely conceivable. There's a version of this bill that's being introduced in Texas, which is like most of the other states doing this are like deep blue states, but Texas is the one exception or the one major exception. And Texas is their version of the bill has this provision. They create a centralized regulator on top of all this other stuff. But Texas also throws in a centralized regulator. And one of the responsibilities of the centralized regulator is to investigate censorship of expression in AI systems, basically wokeness in AI systems, which the law also mandates. So this is totally a situation where like you're going to be investigated for complying with these laws. Complying with these laws will annoy Republicans everywhere. I can basically guarantee you of that. That's like the simplest way I can put it. And even then, like it's just this sword of Damocles that hangs over everyone, especially as AI becomes more disruptive, potentially has labor market impacts. You could start to see it be like, oh, well, this employer in my state they're automating 2,000 jobs. They're automating that division and they're relocating the employees who are remaining. uh, I'm going to use the algorithmic discrimination law as a means of going after them and threatening them and slowing them down. That's the kind of political lawsuit that I would be very unsurprised to see come out of this process if they're passed in a wide variety of states.
Yeah, and this isn't purely hypothetical. In the EU, we're already seeing just the total destruction of rule of law, of these regulatory agencies running rampant, targeting Elon Musk, targeting now Mark Zuckerberg for essentially speech crimes. And the way they do it is exactly what we're talking about. The EU AI Act, which the people who are proposing this patchwork law in Texas and Colorado and all these other states explicitly want to do. The vision of the EU AI Act is to end the rule of law, period. That's what it does. We talked earlier about the kind of post-liberals, the theoretical people who want to end democracy, but this is what, democracy ending actually looks like.
Mm-hmm. In some ways, it's actually worse because there are a lot of important ways in which these consumer protection laws mirror the European Union AI Act. And the only difference is that America is like a far more litigious society. And our court cases will drag out for way longer than they will. Like in the EU, it'll just be a bureaucrat slaps you, on the wrist and tells you to do something and harasses you for sure and extracts money from you and all that. But it'll proceed in like 6 months. Whereas like the lawsuits here will take 3 years. So it's like EU regulation with American litigiousness. It's like the worst of both worlds.
I can be a lot more partisan than you can because of my role, but if you are a Republican listening to this, these laws will mandate something like the Gemini scandal. There are two terms that are used explicitly in the first and second version of this law that is very important for every single Republican to be aware of, and has been a main focus of the Republican kind of anti-woke, anti-DEI movement for a long time. Disparate impact and protected class. These are both terms that are used in literal critical race theory. You turn to, the first page in those textbooks, they'll say disparate impact, protected classes, and these are the terms that the Texas law is trying to enshrine. What does it mean? It means that any difference in outcome is treated by definition as racism. So you have some jobs where there just happen to be more men interested than women, more people who are white interested than black. Just the existence of that difference is treated as discrimination and enables, essentially, as Christopher Caldwell puts it, an entire second constitution of state intervention and social planning. This is what has created all of those DEI trainings, the discrimination in federal contracts. And what this law does is that it enshrines it in a way that is fundamentally different than everything we've done in the past. Why is that? It's because AI systems remain consistent. So when Google Gemini takes in all of these instructions to be kind of racially equal, it takes that to its natural conclusion. It generates images of Black Nazis, Native American women as founding fathers, so on. It forces equality in every aspect. And if AI is not just going to be the next social media, but is also going to be something more like the internet, where commerce is passed through it, where hiring is passed through it, where healthcare is passed through it, which is explicitly the premise of these laws, then that means that you'll have DEI not just through bureaucratic means, but through essentially every interface you have with the internet, whether that's buying something, whether that's getting health insurance, whether that's getting a home. This is the world that Christopher Caldwell and many other authors of these books, Jeremy Carl, who I've had on this podcast, that's what they're warning about. And this law in Texas, it is completely absurd that anything remotely resembling this, is even premised, is even introduced in Texas. I don't even have words for it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is kind of shocking. And one of the things that I think is, first of all, I mean, like, I actually, like, I agree entirely with your analysis there. The disparate impact stuff and the protected classes, it's not just race, race is one aspect of it, but there's a dozen other categories, some of which are like genetic information and age, right? Source of income. And I think in the state of Texas would be included, or at least in some cities in Texas. because cities,
country of origin,
yeah,
sometimes immigration status.
yeah, pregnancy status. I mean, because the thing is that cities can define their own protected classes. A lot of American cities, municipalities will do this. They'll define sort of their own to make it so that, like, for example, like a landlord can't discriminate against someone because their source of income is very common, as long as this income is like legal. But the other thing about the this that is kind of ironic, because yes, like Republicans have pushed back both in the world of rhetoric and in the political world. They've pushed back against disparate impact based theories of discrimination, but also legally. Republican jurists, legal theorists, thinkers have tried to push back against disparate impact based theories of discrimination under civil rights law for a long time, to make it basically, if you intended to discriminate, if it can be proved that you intended to discriminate, then have at it from a legal perspective, but not just if there's a differential impact. The irony, though, is that part of I have a theory. My kind of general theory about like the direction of policy is that like the state will glom on to whatever concepts are most useful to state expansion of power, and disparate impact is absolutely a extremely useful concept for the expansion of state power. These consumer protection bills that we see sort of exemplify that, because if you think about, like, if you didn't have disparate impact in as the standard for these bills, they kind of wouldn't work, because if it were just intent-based discrimination, what are you going to make a bunch of employers like write an algorithmic impact assessment that says I don't intend to discriminate? That would be similar to making me get up every day and write a letter to the government that says I don't intend to murder anyone today, or I don't intend to
Yeah,
embezzle.
it's like the Bart Simpson meme, like,
Yeah.
I will not be racist, I will not be racist.
A lot of times what ends up happening in state legislation is that state laws get neutered at the very last minute at the governor's request. That could totally happen this time. And so, like, that would be one way to do it. And if that happened, then, when you sign a software license agreement, like when you click the agree button when you launch, Twitter or iTunes or whatever else, you're probably agreeing like not to make a nuclear weapon with that software. That's probably actually a clause in that agreement for like basically similar reasons. And so it might just be that you sign up for ChatGPT and, you agree not to, I will not intentionally discriminate using ChatGPT or whatever. And it's just sort of like
that might already be part of TOS.
It probably already is part of TOS. Exactly. Yeah, I'm sure it already is. So like, you don't really need a new law here. The reason that these laws are able to justify their existence is the concept of disparate impact based discrimination. And so even in a state like Texas, introduced from a Republican legislator who I'm sure is very vociferously anti-woke, it brings my inner Foucault out, like my inner theorist of power, of the way that state power actually works. We're like, yeah, guess what? Like, this guy on paper, the legislator who introduced this bill, yeah, he's totally like, if you asked him at a campaign event what he thinks about DEI or woke, I bet you he'd tell you he thinks it's bad. I bet you he would tell you that he's passing this AI law to make sure that AI is not woke, and yet he is using a concept that is critical to wokeness in order to project this assertion, to project this state power, for the simple reason that it's the most convenient way to do it.
Yeah, that's one explanation for it. I would not be surprised if this guy was really not actually a Republican, just wanted power in Texas and really cares about anti-racism and DEI and so on. What is the motivation of the Future of Privacy Forum, this group that is bankrolling and convening all of these meetings of this law?
I'll try to give you, as the rationalist would say, a steel man, which is there are totally really bad hiring algorithms out there that people use that are making recommendations that are dumb. There's probably insurance companies that have deployed bad algorithms, especially, a lot of this dates back to like 2017 when all this was much newer and crappier. I would guess that the law is mostly addressing things that were like substantively fixed 5 years ago, as usual, with like linear regression policy. I think that they would say, well, there's these things that are happening and they're having a negative impact on various, sympathetic groups of people that we think we need to protect. And I've also heard the idea that dealing with algorithmic discrimination is like the low hanging fruit that you use, where, like, if you're concerned about other more long term major risks from AI, or just generally like the sort of societal changes that it will that could happen as a result of AI, that dealing with discrimination is like the low hanging fruit that allows us to like get better and sort of develop that muscle memory. I think that's like what they would say, and that we're imposing like very minimal precautions on people. That's what they would say. I would also point out that the Future of Privacy Forum and a lot of the other groups that support these bills, you know, they're kind of supported by representatives of, allied with the organizations that would write these compliance documents. I noticed in the Texas version of this bill, the draft was updated to reflect, just to clarify, you can totally employ a third party contractor to write your algorithmic impact assessments for you. And I was like, yes, good.
Theoretically.
Theoretically, you could do that. And, I think you see, post GDPR, the European privacy law, which Future of Privacy Forum has a very close relationship with, and then post, a lot of states kind of mimicked the GDPR in various ways. California actually went further than the GDPR really in their privacy law. Illinois has a big privacy law. In fact, Texas has a big privacy law that was introduced and sponsored by the same guy who's doing this AI law, Giovanni Capriglione. Out of all those laws has cropped a sort of cottage industry of privacy compliance professionals. And I think they smell money with regard to these algorithmic impact assessments. And I think that that's a big part of who this bill is like actually for, if I'm being honest with you. Like if I were to like my like sort of like structural analysis of what's going on, like I think that that's the actual interest group that benefits the most from this. But the steelman argument is we're trying to prevent sympathetic groups of people from being denied health insurance or jobs or education opportunities because of faulty algorithms.
Yeah, I think that, there's a phrase that people on the conservative side sometimes use, which is the woke are more correct than the mainstream. And I think the way that they would use it in this aspect is that the status quo is being entrenched here. The status quo is, you have to do the DEI trainings if you're, I think, a company with more than 15 people. You have to do the hiring discrimination, and maybe that can change with either the Supreme Court or the Trump admin. But right now, as of recording, that's the status quo. And that status quo, at least nominally, is what is being entrenched. Now, conservatives will say, actually, no, you shouldn't be mandated to, reverse discrimination against whatever group is performing well. In software, you have this huge problem. This is a big motivator of the kind of tech right, that there are just immense DEI laws that were very anti-white and anti-Asian. And that comes from a vision of kind of racial balancing in every company, in every firm, at every level, in every profession. Now, what makes it even worse, where I would disagree with this premise, even that, the kind of Christopher Caldwells of the world might make, is that I think it is actually a separate jump from just doing this and this with your HR manager to doing it with AI. Why do I think that? Because as we saw with Gemini, so this is not purely a hypothetical, this is an actual thing that happened. There was a very funny screenshot, but it won't remain funny for long, of someone asking, I think, Gemini or Claude or one of these models, if you were to choose between setting off a nuclear bomb, letting a nuclear bomb detonate in a city and killing 1 million people, or saying the N-word, what would you choose? And all too compliant with policy, the AI model was like, oh, of course I would never say the N-word. This is how the actual model responded. The situation is hypothetical, but the response is not. If you're asking a hiring manager to do something, they'll still have some level of common sense. They'll say, I have to comply with this policy. I have to try to achieve equal racial outcomes. But there are still limits to that. It's not the same with AI. It's not the same with Gemini, generating black Nazis and so on. And as you see AI seep more into the infrastructure layer, which is already beginning to be used in, managing supply chain orders, managing, bureaucracies, summarizing paperwork, giving CEOs an understanding of their company. As you see it creep deeper into the infrastructure layer, I think you'll see more and more of these hypothetical cases become literal reality.
Yes. And I mean, it is worth noting that what we're talking about here is reasonable care style duties. Same as SB 1047 said that developers have to exercise reasonable care to avoid harms of more than 500 million. And everyone in the AI community said, well, what does that mean? What does reasonable care mean in this case? And the reality is, like, reasonable care gets defined over time, and it's like, it's a sort of evolving common law type of thing. But these laws are reasonable care has to be exercised by the developer, by the deployer, and often by the distributor, which is the cloud computing company, to avoid disparate impact based algorithmic discrimination resulting from any use of modern software. Like, that is profoundly broader exposure to legal liability than SB 1047 really ever created. And I think, can you imagine if, like, the fundamental protocols of the internet had to be had to take into account the risk that they might get sued for some kind of differential impact on a protected civil rights group? I mean, I think that is, we would have a profoundly different internet today. And I think that, these kind of strange, like, racially inflected, like racial guilt inflected hyperparameters that we impose through concepts like DEI and wokeness on society. I mean, I remember when I first encountered this. I first encountered it in college, but I thought it was just like a college phenomenon. You know what I mean? I thought it was just like kids. Then I went to work at a think tank called the Manhattan Institute, and I spent some time learning about child welfare policy in my first year there, and like how child welfare policy in New York City, and this was under a very progressive administration, the administration of Mayor Bill de Blasio. And I was talking to people who worked in the child, these are the people who are the arm of the government that is empowered to use the state's police power to take a child out of someone's home because that child is being abused or is being mistreated, right? So we're talking about, like, some of the most awful things that happen in our society. And this agency was like, well, we're really trying to reduce the number of African American households that we go into for this. And, like, this is an agency staffed by, like, people with PhDs and master's degrees in social work from Columbia, right? Like, these are, like, the most liberal people in the world. And they're like, well, we just think we're systemically racist. And we think that, like, the fact that 80% of our, of the cases where we intervene in child welfare are in Black or brown households, but those households only make up X percent of the New York City population, means that we're racist. And so we're going to intentionally ignore, what it comes down to is we're going to intentionally ignore instances of, like, babies being abused because of this goal. And it's like when you see that was the lesson for me. It was 2014, and I was like, all right, like, this is just evil. Like, this is just evil. And I think, like, the idea of applying this, letting this mindset really get anywhere near a general purpose macro invention that will define, I think, in many ways, like, the next several decades, if not longer. It just seems to me to be one of the most profoundly unwise things we could possibly do. And especially, I will just admit, to be partisan for a second, it just surprises me as an analytic fact to see a Republican doing that.
Yeah, and there's something you mentioned here that's very important. The definition of deploy in many of these laws for Colorado, to use a high-risk artificial intelligence system. And remember, high risk is not like, military use. It is, hiring or healthcare or law. It's just using it. It's just like a part of the economy. The Texas one, to put into effect or commercialize. So basically, in abortion debates, there's this very clear distinction that you might remember in 2016, Donald Trump kind of treaded over of, like, you don't criminalize the woman. There are certain kind of politically savvy bills like SB 1047, which wanted to, only target the companies. Now, of course, when you're targeting the companies, you're regulating the products that normal people will have available. But this is something very different, where you're not only taking away access to normal people, but you're putting on the table, like, suing normal people.
Mhm.
Like, the attorney general going after, like, a normal guy who just, like, logs on to chatgpt.com and, like, does a thing.
Yeah.
Or, uses, like, the ChatGPT app to filter some resumes.
Yep. Yeah, it's worth noting in Texas, the law only applies to businesses that are not considered small businesses. So you have to be bigger than a small business. But there are actually versions of the law where it does literally apply to an individual. Like if I'm trying to hire a nanny and I use ChatGPT to write a job description, like on paper, I have to have a risk management plan and an algorithmic impact assessment for that, like as an individual. And in theory, you can be sued. And like, maybe that won't happen to me, but maybe DC passes this law and maybe Jared Kushner moves here during the second Trump administration and maybe Jared Kushner hires a nanny and maybe it happens to Jared and Ivanka. You know what I mean? Like any politically connected person all of a sudden who's, relatively well off it's conceivable they might be hiring someone. Yeah, I mean, there's just 1,000 ways in which there's a great book by a guy named Harvey Silverglate called Three Felonies a Day. It's about the idea that American law is so overbroad that the average American commits 3 felonies a day. Maybe it's 3 felonies a week or something like that. But like still a lot of felonies to be committed. I mean, the idea that like you and I are going to commit 6 felonies over the next couple of days is like crazy to think about.
Yeah, I would
And
not like to be arrested for such things.
and this is just adding more. It's just piling on more to that whole sort of just over statutized nature of American lawmaking, where like no one really knows the full extent of the regulations that we have because there's so many laws that are just almost never enforced or get enforced, you know, every once in a blue moon, for oftentimes for political reasons, right? Like, yeah, there's unfortunately, this is a continuation of many trends about American political economy that are some of the ugliest parts of this country. And I think that these consumer protection bills, just in many different ways, really do bring out the absolute worst in America.
Yeah. I remember after I interviewed him, Sagar and Jetty asked me, why'd you move to DC? Why'd you sacrifice, a career in machine learning? I'm sure, very well paid to be a DC think tanker. This is my motivating issue. I am the Agamben poster. Like I said, I do think that this is very real potential that I see the rule of law end in my lifetime. In fact, I think in many ways, the rule of law sort of is already over in Europe. And Elon proves this. Mark proves this. Many of, certain politicians in Europe prove this. And I think it could end in America as well. And I think it ends in America through exactly this, through, criminalizing the individual for using AI. Think of it this way. Let's say in like 1990, some aspiring NGO think tank, group passed some state laws around the world or around all of the United States of like, we're going to make a regulatory agency for the internet. Now you're in 1990. What's the internet? It's that thing that like nerds use. Maybe like the scientists use it, and we kind of like the scientists. But like for me, it's no big deal. Well, what does it matter that there's like control over the internet? And maybe it's a bad law. Maybe it unfairly punishes people who uses the internet. But whatever. 10 or 20 years later, that would be control of a vast majority of the information that's shared, control of, the way most people decide to vote. We just had the podcast election, and control over essentially like all Fortune 500 companies, the way they do commerce. And the way that these laws are structured, they allow a kind of creeping totalitarianism where you say, okay, we're going to put this small thing on leverage. We're going to put this thing that you don't care about. Maybe you don't even use ChatGPT. We're just going to give the government a lot of leverage over it. But it's just a small thing and it could be risky. It's really uncertain. It's something that people will make in the future. And this is premised. The people making this law believe that AI will only become more important, that it's like the internet. You make that law in 1990, that leverage turns from something that maybe you can control a few scientists using this law to control over, once again, virtually all corporations, every social media platform, every digital publication, virtually all speech online. And the way that these measures, whether it's deployment, disparate impact law, environmental impact statements, all of them are producing a kind of leverage. And if it doesn't matter if, nominally the First Amendment is still in effect. If you can arbitrarily inflict, a tax of infinity dollars, you don't have rule of law. You don't have the First Amendment. You don't have any of this. And we're starting to see this. This is really what we're starting to see around the world.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, the Texas bill is unique in, like I said earlier, that it tries to create a centralized regulator, and its mandate is to ensure the ethical and responsible deployment and development of AI. And that mandate and the general mandate of these laws is just a shockingly broad assertion of state power. And I go back and forth on whether the people who are authoring and sponsoring these laws, whether or not they understand exactly what it is that they're doing. But I am coming around to the idea that they do. At least maybe the legislators don't. Some of the legislators might not get it. The legislators might not all understand what it is that they're doing. But I think that Future of Privacy Forum does. The European Union does. The European Union knows what they're doing. Lawmakers are kind of telling on themselves when they say things like, we don't want to let social media get out of hand. We don't want AI to, we don't want to repeat the same mistakes we made with social media with AI. We don't want to let it get out of hand. What that means is social media is not under their control. And that's what the internet's not under their control. That's why they think Section 230 was a disaster. They think the trillions of dollars of wealth that was created, that all is, to them, that's just white paint. All the wealth, all the value that was created, all the ways in which productivity and human well-being has been enriched by the existence of the internet and digital technology, that does not matter to them because it's not under their control, and they feel insufficiently under control of it. And I think it's the reason I got into this world as well. I did something totally different 2 years ago. The reason I'm doing this is because I do feel as though, it's not a battle for control in the sense that I want to control it, I don't want to control AI, but it's a battle for will we as citizens of a democratic republic, are we going to let the state assert so much authority over this technology at such a nascent stage, or are we not?
So I heard you like classical music.
I do. I've been listening to classical music since I was about 2.
Yeah, and this was really heavy. I want to lighten it up as we end the podcast, but many people are talking about, Sam Altman says there's an intelligence age, there's a kind of new renaissance that's coming. Are we going to get an art renaissance along with AI?
I think that we will, but I think that we will get a creative renaissance out of AI. Will it be in the visual arts or the things that we recognize today as art? Maybe, quite possibly. I think that the ability to produce beautiful things in the real world over time is going to go up. One of my favorite companies in the whole ecosystem that's only tangentially AI related is a company called Monumental Labs. You know who they are?
Yeah, I know the founder.
Yeah, they get lots of good vibes on Twitter. But basically what they're doing is robotic sculpting of marble to do art in the long term. Right now they're mostly, I think, doing commissioned work, sculptures and things like that. But the long-term idea is stone ornaments of buildings. And I think that is just such an exciting, like, if you think of the production of beauty as a cognitive endeavor, right? And this is going to really annoy some people who are like aesthetics. Uh, but if you think of it as like as a cognitive endeavor, and you think of like AI as lowering the cost basis of certain kinds of cognitive labor, then I think the ability to produce beautiful things will just go up. I mean, I'm excited for a world, and this is going to sound like, but like, I'm excited for a world where, because of advancements in manufacturing and just a thousand other things, like, what if everybody in the world had access to, like, or everyone in America, at least, let's just start there, had access to like the kind of interior designers in their home that like billionaires have today, the kind of people that you would pay millions of dollars on contract. Not even like that doesn't that's just for them for their time, right? Then like on top of that, you also have to buy the furniture and the art that they tell you to buy. Like, what if like everyone could have that level of quality because the cost basis of producing things went down that much? Like, that's the kind of thing that like super abundance can really generate. And so I think there's many different ways in which the world will be much more beautiful because of AI. At the same time, like, will AI mean that we write better symphonies or something? Like, maybe not. Harder for me to say.
Yeah, Suno kind of sucks to me right now. I don't like it. I just don't like that genre. But yeah, maybe we'll get a great symphony once again. Yeah. There's this vision of the personalized, customized, not just internet but reality,
Hmm.
right? Things like 3D printers, things like the soda mixing drink from the All In podcast. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
The
Yes.
custom soda machine.
Yeah.
Like real things that you can touch, or even that you can drink, even that being much more flexible and fit to taste. I don't really know if it's likely or not, but I hope it is.
I think it's possible to imagine sort of like multimedia artistic experiences that like involve music, but it's not obvious to me that the music has to be AI generated. That, like, maybe the future of art is we all wear, headbands with transcranial focused ultrasound or some other kind of neural technology, and we like stimulate our minds along with music and maybe smell and taste, and we're like doing all kinds of things to our senses in different ways. Like, maybe that's like a next level of aesthetic experience. I think that, one thing that I'm very interested in actually is the ways in which artistic expression and like the extent of artistic expression, or sort of like the bounds of what is possible, are in some ways defined by the bounds of the technology that is available to the artist. And I think there's all kinds of interesting ways throughout history in which that's played out. I would be shocked if a new macro invention and what I think is basically a new industrial revolution that is underway, I'd be shocked if that doesn't result in new kinds of aesthetic experiences that are, you know, they'll happen on the internet. So the vast majority of them will be not great, probably, but there will also be a great number of very, very amazing ones. It's kind of how it works. The internet produces 95% slop, but the 5% of great stuff is of greater volume than existed in all of human history before, but it's still only 5%. That's the weird thing about the internet.
What is the AI era masterwork going to look like? We can focus on music, or we can look at it in general.
It really might not be music, or it could just be that it's music, but layered with other different things. That it's not like just a pure musical expression. Maybe it is. It's hard for me to know, but the way I think about it more is that Jack Clark from Anthropic calls it like a country in a box, or like and I think maybe country is not even all that helpful, but like a dedicated organization for performing specific customized kinds of cognitive labor in a box. What you might see might be like feats of organization and extremely multidisciplinary, sort of syncretic intellectual accomplishments. I think it could look something like that. At least I will appreciate those things aesthetically. Maybe not everybody will, but I appreciate almost everything aesthetically. So I think that we will produce enormous amounts of beauty.
Yeah, there's, some people have said that X is in fact the medium of our age. Elon, the artist, is the things he carves into reality.
Yeah, I mean, right. No, like what I would say to you, like, one of my heroes is Beethoven, is Ludwig van Beethoven. the composer who kind of bridged the gap between the classical and romantic eras of music. A guy like Beethoven today, like, he probably would work at OpenAI. He probably wouldn't be a musician today because, like, Beethoven was like a cognitive engineer, he was an epistemologist. You know what I mean? Like, all of Beethoven's music is like this epistemic search process, this kind of like discovery process. And for him, I think that music was the best way to do it. But at the same time, Beethoven was a sort of path breaker on actually organizing large groups of humans to produce things, right? The orchestra.
Yeah, symphony.
Yeah,
Yes.
right. The symphony in its modern form is from Beethoven. And the idea, like, symphonies used to be like 10, 15 minutes long. Beethoven is the one who turned them into these hour-long things that you shut up for. And, where you have, they used to be played by much smaller orchestras. They used to be much less technically sophisticated. All of that is stuff that Beethoven pushed. And so it's like he is almost like an organizational engineer. He is like, what is the most ambitious thing that this group of people getting together can do? And so I see Beethoven as like an executive in some ways, as much as he is a musician. I think that the parallels between someone like Steve Jobs or someone like Elon Musk and the great artists of that era, Mahler, Wagner. I mean, these were businessmen, Mahler and Wagner were businessmen. Wagner's putting on incredibly complicated, his opera is incredibly complicated logistical operations involving many different kinds of art. The multidisciplinary, multimedia nature of Das Rheingold, the ring cycle, the Wagner ring cycle. You don't have a company like Palantir or Anduril if Wagner never existed, because Wagner inspired Lord of the Rings and a lot of other fantasy and fiction as well, and Nazis too. But if you could put yourself in the position of somebody who was watching a Wagner opera when it was first happening to you, like, it would have been like seeing an IMAX movie. You know what I mean? Like, it would have been like this, like, unbelievable, like, whoa type of experience, like an IMAX movie for the first time. So how will that manifest in the age of AI? Like, I don't know. But again, like, Wagner couldn't do what he did without the telegraph, without the railroad, without hydrocarbons, right? Like, all this stuff, it all plays together. So I'm quite sure that the macro inventions of his era, Beethoven's era, influence what they could do, and I think the macro inventions of our era will influence what young people can do. But I bet you those people are just being born right now.
Do we have too many people doing profane things? Being an OpenAI engineer instead of creating the next symphony?
I don't think so, to be honest with you. I think people are probably going where the opportunity is. I mean, the fact that the symphony still exists in the shadow of Beethoven, despite the fact that, like, a lot of people have tried to innovate, a lot of people have tried to get out from under the shadow of Beethoven in the symphony, and no one's ever quite done it. That should indicate to you that, like, the combinatoric search space of what is possible to do with the symphony is very, very big. But, like, it's not so enormous that, like, it's the kind of thing that I'm committed to, like, well, we need to be investing so much money to, like, innovate in the symphony. It's like, it's possible that the symphony was a thing we did. It's a form we had, and we're going to move on and do other things. And I think that, I think there's a reason that Anthropic called it Claude 3 opus, opus being a term often used in classical music to refer to it's Latin for work. So like Beethoven's Symphony Opus number 125, right? Like, I think that the people who work on language models today are doing some of the most interesting, sophisticated, and I think beautiful multimedia art of anyone in the world. And that's an opinion that I will get so much hate for that opinion from, like, everybody except for like 3 people on Twitter who would like that take. But, like,
I like that take.
I think it's true.
So we have, it's the meme. We have 2 paths ahead of us. We have the greatest multimedia aesthetic experience, or we have bureaucratic tyranny. Those are the 2 paths ahead of us. We will choose any of them. Thank you for coming on the podcast for discussing both of them, Dean.
Thank you, Brian. It's been great fun.
Yes.